Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. When I spoke with Mina Olander in March last year, I asked her how far she thought American President Donald Trump could go in his hostility toward the European Union on a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 represented the worst case scenario. She said it would be around 8.5. Less than a year later, I asked her the same question again. It's probably 11, she replied. Mina Olander is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and an associate fellow at Chatham House. We discuss whether it's time to bury the post-Cold War order and what that would mean for smaller countries such as Slovakia or Finland. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Mina, we are having this conversation exactly on the day when the New START treaty expired. It was the last remaining treaty that limited US and Russian strategic nuclear forces. Does that make you nervous? How problematic is this for Europe?
Well, this is, of course, a historic day in the sense that, this basically brings us back to, the situation before the Cuban crisis in the 1960s. So for the first time, we now don't have any kind of treaty in place anymore. And proliferation of nuclear weapons in terms of new countries acquiring them is, of course, regulated by a different treaty. And it is sort of generally a different question. But nevertheless, this all is part of a very worrying trend, which makes nuclear proliferation, both in terms of the number of nuclear weapons that the already nuclear powers possess is potentially can go up, and also the number of countries that will want to acquire them.
And what does it mean from the European perspective, if you can maybe say a few words about this?
There is, of course, the risk that Russia, as soon as it has the capacity, which is probably not right now the case, because Russia is very tied up in its war in Ukraine. But there is a future scenario where Russia could, of course, start increasing its arsenal again. And that is geographically, of course, very close to us in Europe. So that is a significant cause of concern. And of course, it's not only the number of warheads and the weapons that has been an important part of this treaty, but also the verification systems. The fact that, at least Russia has made very clear already in the past that they have no interest in continuing any kind of verification system is probably as bad as the fact that, now, both countries could theoretically increase their arsenals as well, because then you may get closer to misunderstandings of the Cuban crisis style. So there was, of course, a good reason why this whole system was set up. And that is one part that is very worrisome as well.
So do you think that basically what might bring us back to negotiations or to new treaties might be something similar to what happened in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis? So a big incident?
Well, it's hard to say now because the situation is also more complex with more players, especially with China. That is, of course, one reason why some people have already felt in the past that there's less point to this kind of bilateral arms control regime between the US and Russia when China is at the same time building up its own arsenal and has very clearly expressed that it is not going to agree to any kind of limitations on its own ability to build up its arsenal until it reaches parity. And it's very unlikely that the US and Russia will reduce their arsenals in order for China to reach parity. So that makes the whole constellation more complicated in that sense. So it's not enough anymore in the future to only have Russia and the US on board. But if China indeed is to reach parity with them, we have to find some way to convince China to negotiate as well.
Mina, when we talked in March last year, I asked you how far you thought American President Donald Trump could go in his hostility towards the European Union On a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is the worst scenario, you said it would be probably around 8.5. How do you see it now?
11. I guess it was maybe fair enough assessment, but I think, yeah, there's no reason to be optimistic anymore after the whole Greenland gambit. And some say that it was just to, distract from the Epstein files, but that doesn't really make it better. Like, if the US is willing to go to that kind of a length to distract from some kind of a domestic matter, like, that doesn't make it better at all. So, yeah, I would say that the situation is really severe. And we have now seen, I think the biggest difference to a year ago was that it was still unclear to what extent the US administration under Trump this time would be able to coherently implement its policy goals. And unfortunately, they have proven quite capable. So I think that we tend to constantly underestimate Trump and his administration because of Trump's own incoherent style of speaking. And because he himself so often just sort of goes with the flow and like gets an idea in a live interview and then it becomes policy. So there is that certain level of unpredictability and incoherence. But at the same time, he has a much better machinery now around and behind him, which is quite able to, like, if we look at the J.D. Vance's Munich Security Conference speech from last year, and then we look at the national security strategy, there's a lot of continuity and coherence in there. So I think that's something that we have underestimated in Europe, to what extent this kind of openly hostile attitude could become an official US policy on the highest level.
So what does it mean? How should Europe handle Trump when you said it's probably much more coherent than many people think? And of course, we have seen what you would just mention, the Greenland crisis, the Greenland gambit, which is, in my view, not over at all. It might pop out any time. So how should Europe handle Trump?
Honestly, I don't blame European leaders for having tried it the good way, sort of like having tried this, like, which was very distasteful to probably many European leaders and especially the public's kind of groveling strategy, like trying to bend over backwards to sort of keep Trump on board, especially with Ukraine. I think it was definitely worthwhile attempting that because the stakes are very high, especially when it comes to Ukraine. And supporting Ukraine is just like so much easier, so much more efficient right now if the US is on board and stays on board. So I don't blame anybody for trying that, but we have now like enough evidence that that cannot be the long-term strategy or even for the next 3 years. So Europe needs to now, because for example, when we look at these currently already months-long so-called peace negotiations that the US is leading between Ukraine and Russia, it is very clear that nobody else, and I don't know whether the American team believes that this is going to lead to something, but I don't think that any other participant believes in that this will lead to anything. So the Europeans are just tagging along because they feel like they need to sort of, on some level, support this. Ukrainians are doing the same because they feel like they can't be the ones who don't want peace. The Russians, for some reasons of their own, are like sort of dancing along here. But there's no real prospect here. And this has taken an enormous amount of time and effort for probably nothing. So this is like probably going to turn out a huge waste of time, a months-long waste of time. And here we see sort of that Europe does need to start thinking much more proactively about what is our own Russia strategy. So how can we make Russia genuinely interested in negotiating in good faith? I mean, maybe good faith is too much. I mean, we probably can't expect the Russians to ever negotiate in good faith, but at least to make them interested in seriously negotiating. That's not going to happen until somebody forces Russia to do that. The American strategy has been like to put pressure entirely on Ukraine and basically none on Russia, and that's why it's not moving anywhere. And there will be no sort of resolution, even in the short term, unless Russia feels more pressure. So we need to start looking at what kind of leverage we have in Europe. It was a missed opportunity not to start using the Russian frozen assets in the December European Council meeting. That should still be on the table, for example. We should look much more because we have actually in Europe, like we don't often talk about this, but we have actually more leverage over both Russia and Ukraine than the US does, because we are bankrolling Ukraine. Basically, the US has cut their aid to Ukraine to a minimum. So it's Europe that is doing all the heavy lifting now. although it's not very heavy at the moment, which is also in itself a huge problem. And this is something that the European countries should do immediately. And one of the most harmful sort of effects of these so-called peace negotiations that European countries have really started to, like slacken down their support to Ukraine. So this is like the very lowest hanging fruit that needs to be done immediately. And then also Europe has leverage of Russian assets in Europe, both the frozen ones and others. So I think that we could do much more if we really put our minds to it and stop running after the US team from Abu Dhabi to like wherever they're meeting the next time. So this is a waste of time. On the other hand, there's no point, and there's been also talk about like that Europe should open its own channel to Russia. I don't think that this is a good idea unless we are willing to play much more hardball with Russia, because otherwise it's not going to lead to any other results than what the US is achieving now, which is nothing. So Europe can only like start thinking about such a move once we have actually crafted the strategy, like with as many European countries on board as possible. Where do we squeeze Russia where it really means something to them? Like otherwise there's no point in opening a channel.
But in fact, it was just announced by the United States European Command that the US and Russia have agreed to reestablish high-level military-to-military dialogue. And French President Emmanuel Macron said that preparatory work is underway to restart direct discussions between Europe and Russia over the war in Ukraine. And Macron's top diplomat, Emmanuel Bon, already visited Moscow. So how do you assess such steps?
If we are serious about this, if we want this to lead to something, because like, of course it is not good for Europe to not play any significant part in the current negotiations. But is it worth it? Is the point just to negotiate with Russia? Why should we just negotiate with Russia if the constellation in itself is not somehow significantly different? So I hope that the French who are pushing for this now have very carefully thought about what are the points of leverage and pressure that we can utilize here vis-a-vis Russia. Because like otherwise, I mean, Russia has used every opportunity to, demonstrate that they are not interested in peace. They just use this for like wrecking the Ukrainian energy, like civilian energy infrastructure during a particularly cold winter. So I think actually I'm less critical of the move maybe that Russia and the US EUCOM are establishing some kind of communication channel, because as I was mentioning earlier, I'm worried about the lack of verification mechanism. And I think that this kind of like hotlines can be a good thing. But of course, like with this US administration, one is always a little bit nervous about what exactly will be communicated. But anyway, sort of like that kind of stuff is needed now that the treaty expired. But honestly, like Europe needs to think about this very carefully. What kind of a difference can we make in these negotiations? Is there anything that we can do right now that the US hasn't been willing or able to do? So unless that is the case, then it's probably going to be a continued waste of time.
Mina, you said that it was probably worth to try to somehow please Trump a few months ago in spring and trying to keep him on board, especially because of Ukraine. But may I ask what you think about the approach of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte? Is he too nice to Trump? But even Finnish President Alexander Stubb was playing golf with Trump and so on. So is this the approach that can lead to something?
In the Finnish context, it's really interesting because we have had a remarkable continuity from how the Finnish presidents before Stubb used to handle the relationship with Putin to how they now used and now are applying the same strategy to Trump. Our previous president Niinistö played ice hockey with Putin 2012. Now it's golf. So that perhaps says more about Trump than about Finland. But I think that in the Finnish case, President Stubb has on occasions at the same time made clear that he is pretty clear-eyed about that the US is increasingly not aligned with our values, for example, anymore, which is quite important in that context that he's having this personal contact. I think what has been also quite good is that Stubb has been mediating and communicating between Ukraine and Trump, which has been quite helpful, at least in the spring. I don't know how much it works still, maybe not anymore, but at least a year ago, it was quite useful to have somebody like as a messenger there, especially after that White House ambush of Zelensky by J.D. Vance. So I think in that period of time, it was quite useful. And with Mark Rutte, it's of course, like it must be the worst top job to have right now because Obviously, it must be the most important task of any NATO Secretary General to try to keep the transatlantic alliance together, and that has probably never been harder. However, I do think that he has crossed some limits, even if it wasn't a real negotiation and no real deal was reached, but still, like the way he sort of negotiated on behalf of Denmark and Greenland without having any kind of mandate for it. That was problematic, especially when it's about questions of sovereignty. And then also this kind of speech that he gave to the European Parliament saying that Europeans have to like immediately forget any illusions of being able to do anything without the Americans. That's also extremely unhelpful. So I think it is a difficult balance for him in terms of how he communicates both with Trump and the European allies, and he's somewhat struggling right now, I think.
When Trump leaves our White House in January 2029, will Greenland still be part of Denmark, or will be occupied by American forces or sold to the US? What is your prediction?
I do think that it's still going to be part of the Kingdom of Denmark because it wasn't so bad that there wasn't something good in it too. So there's no preparation for this Arctic Sentry for Greenland. There was this like quite actually united reaction. Of course, not all European countries will feel they can express their solidarity as loudly as others, but we saw this immediate reaction from the Nordic group and also the bigger European countries, France, Germany, UK, they were all like in some form or another, they were on board with this. So I think that that was a very good experience, and especially how that then prompted Trump to step back from the very acute threats. So that was a good experience for Europeans. There was this moment like, wow, we showed a united front and it worked. So I think we basically need more of this kind of experiences that actually we stick together. If we do speak with more or less one voice, that actually can work really well, and that may actually be the better strategy to deal with Trump, that we quite clearly show like, okay, this is really now crossing a line. I do think that sends some message home. I was surprised that Trump was so deeply impressed by the, I don't know, 9 people that the Nordic countries sent in total. I personally totally underestimated these soldiers because it was like 2 from Sweden, 3 from Norway, something like that, 2 from Finland. I thought that it wouldn't impress anybody, but it did actually deeply impress Trump. So I think more of that is what we need to do.
So do you believe that it was somehow a combination of showing unity and strength and the diplomatic effort? Because some people are saying it was just because, we have been really very nice to Trump and Rutte was very nice to Trump and so on. Others are saying, yeah, because of Macron was saying, yeah, we have to defend Greenland. So was it, from your perspective, was it a combination, or was it one thing or another?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to say because we don't know how the conversation exactly went between Trump and Rutte, which is, of course, part of the problem with Rutte's role. I do think that it was a combination of things because this was the first time that the Europeans really did push back. Trump reacted, at least on Truth Social, quite spicily to this little deployment, the European deployment, and even threatened with tariffs. So I think that there was clearly this kind of, it was registered that we actually we're ready to not just let this go. So I would at least like to believe that it was a combination of factors. And I hope that Trump was more impressed by the European firmness and less by Rutte's kind words.
We are approaching, and you mentioned it already, we are approaching the Munich Security Conference, which was quite dramatic last year when J.D. Vance attacked European allies. What Vance said was recently essentially formalized in a new American national security strategy. Is it time to bury the post-Cold War order?
Yes, I do think so, unfortunately. One could say that maybe it died already maybe in 2022, and it's time to bury it maybe now. I would say that there are still, like, we don't have to go all the way to the point that, for example, the Canadian Prime Minister Carney suggested that like we should sort of just forget the rules-based international order. I don't think that that's the way to go either. I think we should try to sort of like try to salvage the pockets of the rules-based order that still serve us and that work for us, because you cannot underestimate how important this rules-based order has been for small states, like for middle powers as well, like Carney was alluding to from the Canadian perspective, but for small states especially, because this has been a very good order in which small states have been able to exist. So we should do utmost to counter this kind of emergence of a new sort of hemispheres of influence type of order, where the greater powers can just dictate the conditions of sovereignty and existence, and smaller states have to accept limitations on their sovereignty, because this would be very, very bad for our sort of, the feasibility of, for example, European small states. All of us are more or less small in the end. So I think that's something that we should still see to that we can uphold with global partners. And this is also one challenge for the EU and Europe more broadly, that we need to start looking at global partnerships in a different way. And the EU Commission has been very busy in the trade area with this, of course. But we have to really start working much more closely with Australia, with Canada, with Japan and South Korea and other partners who still see value in preserving these norms. To what extent Europe will be able to, and how it will work when our system was based on this very open global order. So if it's not as open anymore, then we have to see how we, with limited options, how we still maintain the feasibility of our model. So yes, the post-Cold War order is probably over, at least in terms of the American hegemony part of it. But yeah, we need to see what still works and try to keep it and adapt it to the new era. Because if we have no new ideas, then it gets very dangerous.
And you partially answered my last question, because I wanted to ask you about Mark Carney's speech. And he gave this speech in Davos at the World Economic Forum. He talked about how middle powers like Canada are not powerless. Carney's speech was generally well received. But my concern is that what you basically mentioned, that, I'm from Slovakia, a country of 5.5 million people, the same with Finland. We are not a middle power, not even close. And I am afraid that countries like Slovakia might be completely screwed, in Trump's word, and less screwed in Carney's word, but still pretty much screwed. So am I too pessimistic about the new world order, whatever it means?
No, you're not too pessimistic, unfortunately. And I think that is the thing, that Europe could, as a combination of all of these, as the sum of its parts, it can be a very relevant global player. And Europe is already perceived as such in the areas where we have supranational competence for the EU, like trade and other regulation and so on. It's understandable that right now everybody's sort of resorting to these minilateral formats with the most trusted partners. And it's a good way to get around these really big hurdles that we're facing right now with NATO and also to the EU to an extent. But we need to see to that we don't just give up on the EU as a multilateral format, and that we now dare to take some integration steps that have been sort of taboo in the past, because otherwise it will be much harder for the smaller European countries like Slovakia and Finland to persist under this kind of pressure. And this is also something that we should leverage much more vis-a-vis other small and middle-sized states elsewhere in the world, because when you look at, for example, China's support for Russia in its war against Ukraine, it's not very promising in terms of what China has to offer in some kind of a Chinese-led order for, let's say, countries in the so-called global south. Because this also very much looks like China is fine with other bigger powers sort of defining what the conditions for existence are for smaller countries. So this is not very attractive actually for a lot of other small states. So we need to also be better at communicating look, we don't want this to happen. We still want to exist and have reasonable conditions for existing in peace, and identify completely new, not only narratives, but also who we talk to and in what way.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.